Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Ray Rice. I'm president here at the University of Maine at Presque Isle, and very pleased to welcome you this evening to a very special keynote address as part of our Libra Distinguished Lecturer Series. We are so pleased to host author and longtime Yankee Magazine editor Mel Allen for this evening's presentation. Because I don't get to say really interesting things by way of introduction because that will be Dr. Hodgkins. But I do get to say we had a wonderful dinner last night with Mel and a number of us, and I think we closed Rodney's, I think. So we were there so long having great conversations, and it is just amazing. Mel knows like all of New England, including the Northern Kingdom, where my mother's family is from, and you probably know Howard Frank Mosher, who lived right next door to my great aunt. So amazing. Okay. So, I mean, who he knows is just amazing. But I'm here to talk about the Libra Distinguished Lecturer Series, not about Mel, unfortunately. So our series has given us the opportunity to present a wide range of speakers, from astronauts and journalists to scholars and adventurers, for our campus and community since 1999. Over the years, we've welcomed more than 100 speakers as part of this series. So we're incredibly pleased to welcome Mel Allen to our campus for a special evening focused on the unique people and places of New England, and look forward to the ways he'll be bringing them to life for us through storytelling. To help set the stage, I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Deborah Hodgkins, UMPI Professor of English, to provide the official introduction. Again, welcome all to tonight's proceedings. Deborah.
Good evening. I'm Deborah Hodgkins, Professor of English, and if I could ad-lib on my prepared comments from our dinner last night, one of the things that I observed about Mel is that not only does he tell great stories, but he gets other people to tell their stories. I left dinner last night going, I talked about all those things? So good evening. I'm also besides being Professor of English, I'm also co-chair of Voices in the North Country, UMPI's biennial literary conference. It is my tremendous pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Mel Allen, who is also generously conducting a writing workshop tomorrow afternoon from 1 to 3. I am grateful to report that the proceeds from the modest workshop fees will help support our next Voices event on October 15th of this year. Please see the save the date over there on the table and mark your calendars. For readers of Yankee Magazine, Mel needs no introduction. From the time Allen published his first stories in Yankee in 1977, nearly 50 years ago, to the day he retired in 2025 as just the 5th editor of Yankee's storied 90-year history, his work as both author and editor has captured New England's unique sense of place and the people who call it home. Mel believes that his education as a writer began when he taught 4th grade in Maine for 3 years and had to hold the attention of 27 children through Maine winters. From his first 2 stories in Yankee's December 1977 issue to the January day in 2025 when he closed his office door for the last time, he spent nearly 50 years finding people and places whose stories he wanted to know and assigning countless others to the finest writers in New England. He became Yankee's 5th editor in the summer of 2006 after previous roles as senior editor and executive editor. In 2018, he was inducted into the Folio Magazine Hall of Fame for editorial excellence. He has also taught magazine writing and creative nonfiction for the past 25 years. According to Robert Root and Michael Steinberg in their introduction to their anthology, The Fourth Genre, the writer of creative nonfiction is often the reader's guide, pointing out the sights along the way, the places of interest where special attention is required. In this wonderfully flexible genre, with many subgenres, approaches taken by the essayist and the memoirist spiral outward toward literary journalism. According to Root and Steinberg, creative nonfiction may be the genre in which both the reader and the writer feel most connected to one another. Mel's new collection of some of his favorite contributions to the magazine, titled Here in New England, Unforgettable Stories of People, Places, and Memories That Connect Us All, available for sale in the back and for a book signing after the talk, references this connection between the writer and reader in the subtitle, while the title grounds us in place in the stories of New Englanders and his own passion for finding, as he says in the introduction, stories that matter. I give you Mel Allen.
Always wanted to be sure that people can hear me okay. Everybody good? Okay, thank you. So thank you for coming here tonight. And I want to thank all of you here at UMPI for making this evening possible for me. Thank you, President Rice, and thank you to Rachel Rice, who first reached out to me, and also her helpful staff who arranged for me to join a class, as well as a workshop for me to lead. And thank you to Professors Deb Hodgkins and Rich Simpson for being there for me and for letting me know your students. And thank you as well to Melissa Lizotte, Emma McNally, and Kaylee Malenfort for your efforts in making this visit happen. And I want to thank the Libra Distinguished Lecture Series for giving me this opportunity to share my stories from my half-century of reporting, writing, and working with writers from all over New England. And thank all of you who joined me here. This is my 26th appearance since Here in New England came into the world in September, and the reception I have received from readers and people who have come to hear my stories has buoyed me. And the hospitality that has been shown and the generosity that has been shown me here in Presque Isle from the people here at UMPI has just, I will never forget that. I want to thank you again. And I also want to thank the extraordinary Allagash writer, Kathy Pelletier. I count Kathy as both friend and inspiration. And it was Kathy who was a catalyst for my visit to your campus. So thank you, Kathy, who's looking on right there. I know that. Before I go any further, I want to congratulate the entire university community on the bequest from the Don and Linda Zillman estate. When I read about it, my first thought was not about the impact that $2.1 million will have for the university and students, which I know will be felt for years, but rather I thought of the love and pride that your former president and his wife must have felt for this institution. That is a priceless legacy. Don Hewitt, the creator of 60 Minutes, once was asked what was the key to that show's phenomenal success. He replied in 4 words, "Tell me a story. That's what I'm going to do this evening." I call this Listening to New England because I want you to hear the voices of some of the most memorable New Englanders I have known. When I write about other people, I will spend hours and often days with them, and as they tell me their story, as they open up their lives to me, the words they speak become like intimate sound albums that I get to keep. And they become part of my life too. When they see me listening intently, they may tell me details of their lives that they may not have told anyone else. Because few people have someone really listen totally to their story. And that's what I do, listen. My book Here in New England would not exist without Yankee Magazine. So I want to begin with a short story about this New Hampshire-based magazine that I called home for so long. The September-October 2025 issue marked 90 years of publication. Just think of the hundreds of print publications, newspapers, and magazines that have disappeared in the last 20 years. So many of them, at one time, were among the most popular in the country. But Yankee kept coming, and it still comes to the homes of people everywhere who feel this tie to New England. I have always known that the special sense of place that people feel for New England, that's the real tug. After my editor's letter last March told readers I was leaving Yankee, I received many messages like this one. Yankee brings me back to myself wherever I am. As I make appearances around the region, I've seen this extraordinary connection to Yankee everywhere. After I spoke in Concord, New Hampshire, I asked for questions, and a man stood up, and he said that because he had just retired, his wife was urging him to cancel their Yankee subscription because he could just read it at the library. My wife is from Georgia, he said. She doesn't understand. I need Yankee to come into my home. I need to hold it in my hands. I spoke in Colebrook, New Hampshire. Now, northern Coas County is mostly small rural villages, just tied together by country roads. I was told to expect a sparse audience. The talk in the auditorium of the Tillotson Center was supposed to begin at 3 o'clock. To my surprise, rather than a sparse audience, the rows were nearly filled. But at 3 o'clock, the door stayed open. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. The door stayed open. I was told they were waiting for someone. Then I heard a murmuring, and I looked to the door, and in walked an elderly woman, supported on both sides. The publisher of the local weekly was in the front row, only a few feet away from me, and she leaned over. I can't believe it, she said. She has not been out of her house for months. She's wheelchair-bound. We have been waiting for a woman who was determined to come and hear stories by a Yankee editor. That is what Yankee's place in New England means to people, even a legendary astronaut. Oh, this meeting uses Zoom AI companion. Huh? Okay. Oh. Okay, thank you. We have to have one technical glitch per talk. Okay. So this young boy saluting in the front row is Alan Shepard, our first American in space. He grew up in Derry, New Hampshire, and it comes from a Yankee series that I called Coming of Age in New England. I saw Alan Shepard on the 30th anniversary of his historic flight. He told me he had been inundated with interview requests from major media from around the country. He told me he had turned them all down, except for just quick phone calls. But Alan Shepard invited me to come to Houston for as long as I wanted, because he said, Yankee is different. Yankee is unique. Yankee is home. On that note, I want to give a quick look at how this iconic magazine came to be. This is Yankee's first issue, September 1935. If you think the cover is homely, compared to the inside, this cover is fine art. This is Rob Sagendorf, who in a small cabin beside his house in Dublin, New Hampshire, brought a new magazine into the world. This was the heart of the Depression, and he felt people would be hungry for and drawn to place, and no place in America possessed such a sense of tradition and continuity, a place with an identity so strong that no matter where you were from, if you said, I'm a New Englander, people would have a sense of who you are. He launched that first issue with 613 subscribers. Well, he thought there were 613. He quickly discovered that 600 of the names were fake. He had been scammed. They were just names from a telephone book. The other 13 names were just family and friends of the publisher. In the late 1930s, Sagendorf bought a failing little publication that was about to go under called the Old Farmer's Almanac. It dated from 1792. He restored the weather forecast that had been discontinued, and the little yellow editions with that hole in the upper left-hand corner, ready to hang from your outhouse nail, kept his Yankee afloat. This is Judson Hale. This photo was taken in Judd's office that he filled with so many historical curiosities that a sign was put up that read, Judd's Museum. Judd spent his formative childhood years in Vanceboro by the St. Croix River, and he always said that in his happiest dreams, he is there again. He was Sagendorf's nephew, and from the time of his arrival in 1958, he began to change the character and look of Yankee. And on the way, he changed my life. Judd made sure that his magazine told stories that mattered, whether humorous or dramatic, even sometimes shocking and tragic. Through these stories, he made this region feel human, real, something to yearn for. In my book, my story about Judd is titled Yankee's Yankee, and it lives in the chapter called Here in New England, which gave the title to the book. Now, Judd loved to laugh, especially when it was directed towards him. Now, I've told Judd, who's just shy of 93, and he lives in a retirement community, and he does not get out anymore. I said, Judd, when I tell this true story that you always told when you gave talks everywhere, I'm bringing you on this book tour with me. So I always imagine that Judd Hale is standing right here telling this story about him. He and his wife Sally were in Tamworth, New Hampshire, and Sally had an upset stomach. At a general store, Judd stopped to get her some Tums. As he entered the store, he noticed an old fellow sitting quietly in a chair next to the door. Judd walked up to the counter and asked the proprietor for Tums. I'd like the cherry flavor, please, Judd said. We don't have the cherry-flavored Tums, the man replied. Well, do you have the orange flavor? No, we don't, said the man. Well then, Judd said, getting a little exasperated, I'll just take the plain Tums. After paying for it, he was walking out the door when the old fellow in the chair looked up at him as he was passing by. And he said, looks like you're going to have to rough it. Judd's right here telling that story. Judd loved storytelling. He loved history and tradition, but more than anything, he wanted to be affected. He wanted stories that mattered, stories that readers would remember. He told me to follow my curiosity and my instincts, that if I felt there was a story worth telling, he wanted to know it. And in all of our decades of working together, not one time did Judd Hale say no to a story that I wanted to follow. And that's what I got to do for my life at Yankee, tell stories that mattered. And not only my own stories, even more as editor-in-chief, I was able to find and publish stories from other writers and photographers. A few years ago, when I turned the corner past 75 and 80 was just ahead, people would ask, when are you going to retire? And my answer was always, I enjoy the work. I enjoy the people I see every day. I enjoy the creation of a new issue from a blank slate to a finished magazine. I call that my short reply. The longer answer came if I talked about what it's like to find people with a gift to move me and how I get to share their work with thousands of people I will never meet. And how many people get to do that? Who would not want to? And who would ever want to stop? I would say, for example, I did not retire because of Joel Woods. When I saw his photos in a small circulation magazine devoted to Maine Islands, I knew I needed to visit him. We met at his cottage in Rockport, Maine. This deep-sea fisherman and lobsterman had never taken an art class, had never taken a single photo class, but his photos stopped me cold. He told me he had grown up tough and raw, and how fishing was for him, I'm quoting, the biggest, baddest, the most hardcore thing I could do. That's why I was drawn to it. I wanted to prove myself. So he began taking photos of the life at sea swirling around him. I was seeing the fisherman's world with brand new eyes, he said. Now, cameras are not made for deep sea commercial fishing, and Joe Woods would go through 4 or 5 a year. The hands that held the camera that shot this photo I'm about to show you, were coated with fish slime. We published Joel's images in a photo essay that I called A Hard Life Made Beautiful. I entered it in the annual City and Regional Magazine Association contest to be judged against photos by professionals across the country who worked for Boston Magazine, Philadelphia Magazine, the Washingtonian, Texas Monthly. Wherever there are cities, there are magazines who use professional photographers. Joe Woods took first place. And I would say, for example, I also did not retire because of Jim Westphalen. 2 years ago, I visited Jim Westphalen, who lives in Shelburne, Vermont. He had just put the finishing touches on his documentary film, Vanish, Disappearing Icons of a Rural America. Jim Westphalen's passion is to have us see the beauty in the forgotten and mostly unseen structures that once filled the lives of people in a different era. Farmhouses, barns, churches, silos, schoolhouses, railroad cars. These photos come from Vermont, but I am sure when you drive through the valley, you will recognize places that Jim Westphalen would find beautiful. He wants to stop time, to let others see what he does, that decay is both poignant and beautiful. I could also say I did not retire because of how special it is to discover an unknown writer. For example, Greg Jalbert. In 1990, I opened an unsolicited manuscript. I did not know the writer. I did not know the name Greg Jalbert. He had grown up in Fort Kent, and he had written thousands of words about his life there. I was taken by his story, but it was way too long. It needed extensive editing. He was living then in Midcoast, Maine. We met, and we spent a day going over the manuscript all day long, if we could just see if we could make it work in Yankee. We did. And when we published the story that I called In the Kingdom of the Jalberts, it was our cover story. It begins like this. I grew up among rivermen. My father was dependent on the wilderness for his life, and I was dependent on him. Although he was an influential Fort Kent lawyer, hosting senators and advising governors on key issues, the thought of living an ordinary life terrified him. In the Allagash wilderness, he became part child, part wild man in search of adventure. As soon as the ice cleared, we began our expeditions on the Allagash. 10 miles up the river from Allagash village, we were often stopped early in the year by a wall of jammed ice. It looked like the blunt face of a glacier and cut us off from the portage trail around Allagash Falls. Using a ladder he had tied to the top of our duffel, we hauled the canoe up and over the jam. Then he took one last look downriver and, like a hunted man, pulled the ladder up after himself. Only once, arriving at the falls in the dark, when the ice wall was leaning, threatening to fall on us, do I remember his turning back. He roared his outboard down through the rapids above the falls, guiding the canoe towards the lip before cutting it hard into shore and up into the brush. Every time he motored down to the lower landing, part of me shot over the falls and drowned. Terror was often the price I had to pay to be with Robert Jalbert on the Allagash River. So to the question, why didn't I retire? The answer was simple. I could not imagine not being amazed day after day with the creative people I met and the voices I heard, and to be given the freedom to bring that work to hundreds of thousands of readers. I was lucky enough to be able to do that at Yankee for over half of its 90 years. Because of Yankee, I saw a New England that few of us see. I met people that many of us do not get to know. And the start of my Yankee life in many ways began here, with the people and landscape of a place that Maine knows as the county. Just driving up here was a little bit like going backwards in time. I drove past Smyrna Mills, where I did a story. I drove past Benedicta, where I did a story. I drove past all the entrances to Baxter State Park, where I spent a week with the last ranger there to know Percival Baxter, who gave the park to the state of Maine. I saw signs for the Allagash, and I did a story on the incredible Allagash girls basketball team from the mid-'70s that won the state championship 2 years in a row from a student body of, I think, maybe 30 at the most. And when the boys and the girls had away games, the school would be closed. But they were a dominant team, and I someone told me that they thought that 1975 Allagash girls team was probably the best in the whole state. Forget about Class A, B, C, or D. Now, my first feature in Yankee was December 1977. I wrote about somebody named Avis Ma Dudley and her homestead restaurant. Does anybody recognize her? I'm just wondering. Okay, wonderful. Avis Dudley was 81 when I met her. She lived in the family home in Mapleton. Her late husband once farmed 210 acres in potatoes, 125 acres in peas for bird's eye. Every meal, 2 farmhands ate with them, plus her husband and her kids. So for every meal, there were at least 8. And she was known as a very fine cook. Since 1963, when the local Lions Club asked to meet and eat there twice a month, Avis Dudley, who became Ma Dudley, as soon as she strapped on her apron in the morning, she had served neighbors and strangers. More than 100,000 of what she told me were guests, not customers, had dined at Ma Dudley's homestead. I've never had a complaint about the food, she told me. Now, when I slipped and I suggested that she may be one of the oldest restaurateurs in the country, she bristled. Not because I implied she was older than most. I never considered her anything like a restaurant, she said, because in a restaurant, they go in the morning and make up a main dish and people come and go. We're an eating place. She worked 15 hours a day in the kitchen that held 8 ovens. People called in requests at least a day before. They not only made reservations, but they ordered and talked with Ma Dudley about the meal. Diners sat in the same dining room where she served family and farmhands for nearly 60 years. People spent the evening. The tables held heaping serving bowls of vegetables, hot sweet buns, and salads, and then the entrees came. And she told me, "Nothing pleases me so much as when the men from the Air Force Base come in and say they've eaten around the world, and this is the best food they've ever had. It really spruces me up when they say that." In September 1977, I joined a crew at Don Gallagher's farm near Fort Fairfield, working right next to the school kids who helped with the harvest during the 3-week break. Some of you may remember Don from his Gallagher Brothers singing group. Gallagher worked the same soil his father once worked. He told me that many of his fellow growers had switched to mechanical harvesters. He said that he still wanted his picked by hand because potatoes picked by machine were 4 times more likely to bruise. At first light, he drove his old yellow school bus down Route 169 to pick up the young workers. Now, though I had worked late shift at a paper mill during my college summers, this was the hardest physical work I had ever known. I imagine some of you here may have known this work as well. You bend over, practically crawling along the dirt rows, and you pick these spuds with both hands as fast as you can and put them in barrels. These photographs come from that 1977 trip I made. Back then, at the end of the day, pickers were paid 40 cents a barrel. Now, on my first day, I watched a young woman leave her row and walk towards a small hill. I was so happy and I was so relieved I could stand up. I was stiff and tired and hungry, but finally, a lunch break. I started up the knoll to fetch my lunch. And then I happened to glance at my watch. It was 9:30 in the morning. I was there a few days, sleeping in my VW camper in the Gallagher driveway. He told me of the inevitable changes he knew were coming to the county and to the county's farmers. Before I left, he told me this. He took out his pocket knife and he cleaned his pipe silently. Then he said quietly, "They don't know what they're missing. They don't know what they're losing." Because I had once taught 4th grade in Maine and had started my writing life at the Maine Sunday Telegram, many of my early stories for Yankee came from Maine. I came to Caribou to write about how cold shaped the character of this place. In my book, the story from 1983 is simply titled Caribou. These photos are from a more recent story that I assigned to the Maine writer Jade Coffin, that we published with the title, Culture of the Cold. Over 40 years ago, this is what I wrote. The wind that swirls the snow in northern Aroostook County is like no other in Maine. People of the prairies would know it, for it is a farmer's wind, driving across the northern plateau into the valleys of the St. John and Aroostook rivers, unfettered by trees. The visitor's strongest impression of northern Aroostook is of distance. He cannot believe he can see so far. The land lies open on all sides with horizons that remind you of being at sea. The people are open and friendly, made of more than a little steel, cultivated through generations, facing tough times and coming through. And more than anything, it is winter that tempers that steel. Stories of the cold pass along through generations like heirlooms. Claire Piper, a lifelong Caribou resident, told me about remembering her parents talking about Friday the 13th of February 1861. Anybody remember that? They called it Cold Friday, she told me. It was 36 below with a vicious wind, and it was unusual to have the wind with that cold. People who went out for just a few minutes had to struggle to make it back inside, but the mailman was determined to bring the mail. His name was Boobar, and he was known for his size and appetite. He was always glad to be invited in for a meal. He went on snowshoes 12 miles to Presque Isle, got his load of mail, and started home. But the wind got him, and he cut down a cedar tree, and he kept a fire going all night to stay alive. The next day, she said with pride, Boobar brought the mail. That's what I love. You hear those stories, and you don't ever want to forget stories like that. Now, I spent several days at a fishing camp beside the Miramichi River in New Brunswick. The man on the left is Bud Levitt, the legendary outdoor columnist of the Bangor Daily News. He was a close friend of the man on the right. When I've shown this slide elsewhere, not everyone recognizes the man on the right until I show this one. That's Ted Williams, the greatest Red Sox player of all time, who has been called by Ted himself the greatest fly fisherman of all time. The story in the book is called Fishing Buddies. It tells how two lifelong friends who bonded over their love of the outdoors had only one way to express their affection for each other, through insults and ribbing. It began the moment we arrived. We arrived just past 6 o'clock. Ted Williams was sitting at the end of a dining table, perched by the windows overlooking the river. He glanced up from his dinner of spaghetti, salad, and pie, served by his longtime housekeeper, Edna Curtis, whose husband, Roy, had guided Ted for 25 years. "You said 5 o'clock. You messed up our evening's fishing already," Williams flung to Bud in greeting. "I can go home," Levitt replied. "Do you know how lucky you are to be here?" Williams said. They talked that night, sitting on the porch until it grew too cold and they moved inside. Now, few sentences slipped by without jabs about the other's weight, or lack of talent in the outdoors, or their taste in equipment. They argued over the proper number of pockets in a fishing vest. They argued whether raincoats should have pockets at all. Now, some of you may recall the famous Nissin bread commercials in the 1980s, where these two men debated whole wheat versus white bread. Those commercials came about because a Nissin executive read this story, and they are among the most famous TV spots in Maine television, and they still live today on YouTube. I came to Chesungcook Village one winter by floatplane. This is me leaving Chesungcook Village by floatplane. I came in winter to write about Bert and Maggie McBurney, who had carved out a life in one of the most isolated spots in Maine. Their Chesungcook Lake House, which fire destroyed years later in 2018, was famous for the Paris-born Maggie's cooking and Bert's wilderness skills. Bert had grown up in the village. He joined the army in 1950, and he met Maggie in Paris. She had always dreamed of living in wilderness. She told me that if Bert had been from the city, she never would have come back to America with him. Bert told me that in basic training, he met a kid from the Bronx who took him to the city for the first time. He said, quote, "The sun was coming up and we were driving, and all of a sudden, these goddamn mountains were coming at me, except the mountains were square." He told me we have everything we need about his life with Maggie, except we don't have civilization. And he smiled when he said the word civilization. He said it can get hard to keep track of what day of the week it is. Now, Maggie told me that Chesuncook life suited her, but someday, she said, someday, she would like to see Portland. She has read it's a lovely city, and she's been there for over 30 years, and she had never been to Portland. I spent several days and nights with the launch crew of a new Navy destroyer at Bath Iron Works. I sat with George Costain, who by then had retired, having launched 177 ships. He told me of the terrible creaking the ships would make when they used to be tied to the land by cables. It was like it was full of ghosts, he said. And he told of the terrible stillness just before the ships came loose, when if anything went wrong, he would be powerless to correct it. I'd be so nervous I couldn't eat. There were no second chances. There was always the fear. Did I forget something? I'd always warn the children, said his wife. Your father has a launch this week, so be quiet. He said he'd wait by the window, listening for the whistles to blow, the signal of a successful launch. Until then, I never knew. People don't understand, he said. It's not natural to move something so big. Now, I could go on and on with just my main stories, but I wanted to tell a few more, especially this one about a man named Edward Dahlgren, who received the Medal of Honor for his valor in World War II. He had seen some of the most terrible fighting in Europe, Salerno, Cassino, where he had been shot through the shoulder, Rapido River, Anzio, the invasion of southern France, winter in the mountains, Germany and the Siegfried Line, Austria. Once he was on the front lines for 130 days without a break, in combat every day. I just wore out, he once told his sister. I just wore out. Now, Ed lived and raised his family in Mars Hill. In 2012, 6 years after her father died, and just after Memorial Day, 2006, and the Bangor Daily News made it the lead front page story, and flags flew at half-mast throughout the state, his daughter, Susan Daignault, published a memoir about her father and the unseen heroism of his lifelong struggle with PTSD from the trauma of his battles. She sent me the book, and I wrote this, which she put on the cover. Sue Daignault honors her father, the war hero, her father, the anguished soldier, her father, the man. She writes with passion and unflinching honesty. This book, about an embattled World War II Congressional Honor of Medal recipient, could be read by every family of a returning soldier today with a knowing nod. Ed Dahlgren's life in rural Maine deserves to be remembered. In my Yankee story about Ed, I wrote this. Ed Dahlgren almost never, ever tells war stories. The men he worked with for years don't remember him ever mentioning what he did to receive the Medal of Honor. He was a potato inspector. His children say they can count on one hand the times he ever mentioned the war. If he mentioned Oberhof in France, it would be to tell them a river ran through it, and it looked a little like the neighboring town of Fort Fairfield. The few times he talked about the war, it would be about the sad, funny things, like trying to sleep in a foxhole filled with water. So he was more afraid of drowning than of being shot. But he had a silver star with clusters, a couple of bronze stars, the Croix de Guerre, and though the children would take them out of his drawer from time to time, they never knew what he had done to receive them, and they never asked. We are driving north on the way to visit the original Dahlgren homestead and the farm where he was born and the house where he grew up. He has not been there for several years, and I can tell he is looking forward to the outing. He's a polite man, and because he's asked about the war, he talks about it. And later his son Michael, an immigration officer in Madawaska, will say this is probably the most his father has ever said about those years. Now just think for a moment what it means to a writer to know that because he's been listening, and because Ed Dahlgren, this American hero, trusted me with his story, that people who love him will know him even more now. This is my water break. And because of Yankee, I found myself in the deep winter snow of Baxter Park with Roy Hughey, the big game biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, Roy had 17 bears wearing radio telemetry collars denning in the wilderness. We snowmobiled deep in the park as we followed pings on his earphones. One ping led him to the den of Rudolphine, an 8-year-old female with 3 cubs. Now, if you look where that hand is, you can see the snout and the eyes of a black bear mama. Her den was at the base of an old white pine tree. Now, if you ever find yourself with a bear biologist at the mouth of a black bear's den, I want you to know that when a bear biologist asks you to hold a net in place outside the den while he readies his equipment to weigh the mother and the cubs, I want you to be sure you ask one important question that I failed to do. Are you sure you gave her enough sedative? Now, Roy Hughey loved bears, and he didn't want people being afraid of them. He wanted people to admire them and respect them. And he always was thankful to me that in the story there was no mention of a snowmobile emergency trip to the hospital and a tetanus shot and the stitches. He never got in the story. Because of Yankee, I had the gift of knowing people in a way few of us ever can. I heard stories that break your heart, and stories that restore faith in people, and stories that inspire me every time I think of the people I came to know. All of these matter. And sometimes there are stories that do all of this at one time. One of the most memorable stories I have done, I titled The Town That Refused to Die. When the producer of the nationwide NPR show, Here and Now, came to see me to do a segment on my book, he had 320 pages to select a passage for me to read. He chose a passage about this man, Danny Wentworth, and about the last shift at the Bucksport paper mill, the place where he always thought he would spend the rest of his life, as had his father and uncle. This is what he asked me to read. Danny remembers the final weeks this way, co-workers struggling with anxiety, the bitter reality that the mill had been sold for scrap, shutting machines down one by one like the lights of a city going out. He knows it's impossible for outsiders to understand the depth of feeling you can have for a machine that you're with as much as you are with your family. He told me, when I shut down #1 paper machine, I got real emotional. It was the first one to start up when they opened up this mill. On December 17th, 2014, in the final hours, Danny felt like, a quote, a family is breaking up. We are connected, he said, and the connection is about to break. Later, he would search for words to describe the days of demolition that followed. The dust of crushed concrete swirling like clouds, seeing the gigantic paper machines ripped apart by excavators that looked like dinosaurs, then loaded onto railroad cars and carted away by AIM, the metal recycling company that now owned the property. The sound of metal clanging against metal as the cars rolled out of town. Danny Wentworth is not someone who talks easily about tears. He tells me that when he and his brother walked out of the mill and through the gate for the last time, with townspeople waiting in the cold rain to applaud and hug them, he held it together. Then he saw Ed and Pat Ranzoni waiting for him. Ed had been his high school baseball coach. Danny did not expect what happened when Pat put her arms around him. He began to cry. For himself, the end of 35 years of knowing where he belonged, for his friends, for his father who would sit by the window and look out at the smokestacks without smoke until the day he died, and Danny now felt the ground giving way beneath his feet. To me, the most important words in the title of this book are that connect us all. All of us here know how this country of ours feels right now, as if we've been sliced in half, and we can't see a way to put this back together. Well, wherever you live, whatever your political or social or cultural beliefs may be, you will feel what Danny Wentworth and this town felt when a way of life was pulled out from under them, and you can talk about that with anyone. To tell the story of the Bucksport paper mill through the lens of someone like Danny Wentworth, I felt privileged to have the chance to do that. I could keep you here for days with tales of what I have seen and the people whose voices and stories became part of my life. But we have this hour, and so here are a few more excerpts from the many that live inside here in New England. That man holding a rope, bending down with a rope tied to that pig, well, that's me, age 30. I lived close by to a man I knew who needed help rounding up his pigs. That's the man standing behind me. He lived by a lake in Bridgeton, Maine. I lived by a lake only a few miles away. The man behind me was not yet 30, but already people were beginning to know something about him. You might know it too in this photo taken 2 years after our pig roundup. I met Stephen King and his wife Tabby when I was writing for the Maine Sunday Telegram. He had written Carrie, and his new book, Salem's Lot, was starting to get attention. I was still a freelance writer, now for Yankee, when I went with him to visit Hampton Academy. It was the high school where he had been teaching when he sold Carrie his first book. I called the story The Man Who Writes Nightmares. Now, Stephen King was rejected so many times for one particular magazine that when it finally published one of his stories, the acceptance letter came with an editor's note. We're finally happy to have said yes to this young man. Now, these are Stephen King's words. When I started Carrie, I'd finished my first year of teaching. I was working in summer at the laundry to try and make ends meet. I started writing, but after 4 pages, I said, this really stinks, and I threw it in the rubbish. I came home and found my wife, Tabby, had taken those pages out, and she left a note. Please keep going. It's good. Since she's really stingy with her praise, that's what I did. Now, when I finished it, I sent it off to Doubleday Publishing. We were having a really tough time. We had 2 small children. Our phone had been taken out. When the telegram came saying the story was accepted with a $2,500 advance, Tabby had to call me at the school from a phone across the street. I was in the middle of a teacher's meeting, and I was on pins and needles waiting to get home and hug her. Later, my agent told me the paperback rights were bought for $400,000. I said, no, that can't be right. You mean $40,000. He said, no, Stephen, I mean $400,000. And I realized I wouldn't have to teach anymore. There must be some teachers in here, I know that. Far away from the fame and fortune of Stephen King is the story of Sandy Mancy. In my story, The Gift, you meet Sandy Mancy. She lived in Vermont when one day in 1977, she took one single Kodak Instamatic photo of something that emerged from Lake Champlain. Some of you may know the legend of Champ, and this is the only photo ever considered legitimate of Champ. This photo has never been disproved, has never been altered. I did not visit Sandy to prove or disprove whether Champ was real. I wanted to know what the years had been like for her after the photo was published by the New York Times and all that commotion that stirred up. You know, she told me, nobody has ever asked me how what I saw changed me. Nobody. She said the photo was a gift. I asked, what did she mean by that? It's the gift of witnessing something not everyone has seen. And she continued, I've learned patience, I've learned humor through it, and I've learned tolerance. If you want to ridicule me, well, that's okay. I don't care if you believe me or not. I'm telling you, I saw something. I asked if she loved the photo. She laughed. I don't even have it hanging in my house. I'm not emotionally attached to it. What I have is here, and then she touched her eyes. And what I have is here, and then she touched her heart. That I love. I love that a lot. I know it's there. I will go to God, and I'll stand before him and say, God, why me? God, now tell me what it was. I know this, she said. Lake Champlain has something, a secret, a hidden treasure. And it's wonderful and it's magnificent, even if you don't believe it's there. Someday I'll be vindicated. And people will say, remember that old lady from Vermont? Now, in my postscript, because each of my stories has a postscript, because some of these stories go back 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, I note that when she died in 2018, her obituary requested that donations be made to fund an expedition to prove the existence of Champ. When I give talks, I'm often asked what stories remain among ones I will never forget. I say, I never forget the people whose stories I tell, but sometimes one will always stand out. Now, I know that a week ago, right here in Presque Isle, you had the Poetry Out Loud finalists for the Northern region. If any of you went to it, you may know what a student goes through in order to get to that place. This is a story of one such person. A few years ago, I met a young man named João Rodrigues Victor. In January 2016, he arrived in Maine from Angola. He came with his father and 2 younger siblings seeking asylum. He spoke Portuguese, he spoke Lingala. He spoke no English. His father had once been imprisoned and beaten for being an opponent of the ruling party. His father's best friend had just disappeared. His father could obtain only 4 visas, so he fled Angola with his 3 youngest children, leaving behind his wife and 3 daughters. When Victor tells me the story of coming to Maine, it starts like this. The last time I saw my mom, it was a January night. We had escaped to Congo in a bus. She was sitting with me at the airport. I was looking at her, and she was making sure that my tie was okay. She said, you must find your way to succeed. You have to take it. When he arrived in Lewiston, Maine, he told me it was so cold, quote, I couldn't feel my hands. I couldn't talk. Mostly, though, he remembers feeling confused, feeling lonely. When Victor entered Lewiston High School in the 9th grade, he translated all of his assignments into Portuguese and then back into English so he could understand what needed to be done. In the spring of his junior year, Victor learned about Poetry Out Loud, a nationwide program with over 275,000 students competing in poetry recitation. He was inspired when he saw that Maine's current champion was also an asylum seeker. He told me, when I saw him, I said, how can I do this? How can a teacher help me? Jim Saragusa, that man on the right, was set to retire after 35 years of teaching English at Lewiston High School. He was also the head of the high school's Poetry Out Loud program. He said he will never forget the morning in 2018 when a young man ran into his classroom. He said, my name is João Rodrigues Victor, but just call me Victor. Can you help me do poetry out loud? No one had ever done this, Jim Saragusa told me. No one had ever come in and said, teach me, show me how. Victor was so excited, so enthusiastic, I haven't even heard him yet. But I think, he can do this. And he told me, I feel God gave me a final gift in my last months of teaching. They practiced together before first bell. Victor returned every afternoon after dismissal. They worked together weekends. Victor watched hours of YouTube videos of past champions reciting. After school, he ran 2 miles to his dishwashing job at a local hospital, reciting poems along the way. After his shift ended, he ran the mile to his house. He did schoolwork until midnight. He recited poems in his sleep. He became a masterful reciter of poems. He became an orator really, in a language he had never known. In spring, he became Maine's Poetry Out Loud champion. He was accepted to a Maine college, but he had little funds and he needed $20,000 to be able to attend. He went to Washington, D.C. for the Nationals. He was named one of 10 finalists from over 50 state winners, and the national winner would receive $20,000 in scholarship money. I met him shortly before the Nationals, and Victor's voice and his story now is part of the fabric of my storytelling in New England. Now, I cannot imagine any town, any business, anybody not embracing someone with this drive and work ethic. I tell his story in The Unfinished Journey of Zhao Victor. In July 2025, 7 years after I first met Victor, I received an email from Jim Saragusa, who had kept me posted every now and then in the years since I met them. Among other news, he wrote, "Victor is doing well. The then mayor of Lewiston, Kristen Cloutier, who made Victor Lewiston's first poet laureate, found him a lawyer in 2019 to take his asylum case for free. And he finally had his hearing with his siblings and both parents. His mom came to the U.S. about 2 years ago. He just got his answer 2 days ago, and they were all granted asylum. Then just a few weeks ago, Jim sent me this. Victor is starting a 1-year course, Villanova Interdisciplinary Immigration Studies training for advocates. He'll be a certified non-lawyer immigration advocate who can actually represent clients at hearings when a lawyer isn't available. And then he's also sent me even more recently that Bath Ironworks has accepted Victor in their apprentice electrician programs, something he had always wanted to do. All around us, people have stories of endurance and bravery and kindness, and sometimes I am lucky enough to hear them and give them to others. This photo of Al Nugent, who everyone called Nuge, and Patty Nugent, was taken 1 week after they put ashore on Chamberlain Lake in 1936. I tell about Patty and Nuge in Allagash, a love story, and it comes from a chapter I call The Ways We Love. Picture this, 2 people setting out into the wilderness with everything they owned on a 50-foot-long raft that Al Nugent made. This was a time when you could lay claim to wilderness if you intended to live there. Their dream was to build a sporting camp. Now, in time, Nugent's sporting camps became one of the most famous in the country. Patty came from around the world to taste of Maine, little changed from a long ago they could only imagine. Patty remembered this. These are Patty Nugent's words. At 9:15 the next morning, we landed on the eastern shore of Chamberlain Lake. We started up the lake in a canoe looking for a campsite. We went up one side and we came down the other. I looked across, I saw a little green knoll, so we came across to look at it. There was a brook, and we walked up to it and climbed over a little hill, and I thought, this is an elegant view. A little breeze was blowing, and Nuge said it was a prevailing wind from the northwest. It would keep the flies away. Nuge put his arm on my shoulder, and he said, just right, little girl. This is just right. She had lived nearly 20,000 nights since that summer night in 1936, but she remembered that journey up the lake as if somehow had been preserved under glass for her to admire for the rest of her life. Nuge had suffered a fatal heart attack 8 years before, and she was running the sporting camps alone with helpers. I was there with Patty for 4 days and nights. I had my 5-month-old son Dan with me, and Patty rocked him for hours while we spoke. Now, before we took this next photograph, I made sure to pick my son up from Patty's lap. The words she said as we were waiting for the float plane to fly us back to Greenville have stayed with me for 40 years. These are Patty's words. Everywhere I go, people tell me I'm a legend. A movie man wanted to come and make a movie of me. It don't make me feel any different. It's just my home. You know something? I'd give everything back in a minute for just one night to do over. The night me and Nuge pushed off and floated so slow up this lake. And in the dawn, I looked across and saw that little green knoll. Patty and Nuge now lie together in the East Millinocket Cemetery. And carved into the gravestone, right across, are the words, "Just right." I'm going to end with a story about a young writer willing to do anything for a story. It comes from the final chapter I call Memories. I think I will never have a better audience for this story than this one, because soon your Can-Am sled dog race will be one of the top sports stories in Maine. And in the audience right now, I know, is a really, really good sled dog racer who I met today. And I told her, well, you're going to like this last story. And few people will have a greater appreciation of how much work and how much passion goes into the sport than I do. And this is why. Kathy Beliveau, the PR person for the New Hampshire Sled Dog Association, had this idea. I would enter a sanctioned sled dog race in Rangeley, Maine. I would drive a 5-dog team. Her husband, Ivan, was a highly competitive and intense, I'm going to say, and very intense, professional sled dog trainer and racer. He would be entrusting his dogs to me. I said, yes, this would be an adventure. What could go wrong? I spent a few hours with them at their house, and I learned some basics. They taught me haw to the left and G to the right. And Ivan said, no matter what, if I fall off, never, ever let go of the sled. He told me of a time he did fall, and he did hold on. The dogs took him through a barbed wire fence. Now, if you were talking to a young guy who'd never done this before, would you tell him that story? I don't know if I would. He said not to worry. The team right before me was driven by Joanne, a seasoned pro, and she would be there if I ran into trouble. But here's what happened on race day. Just minutes before I took my place at the starting line, a snowstorm blew in, coating the trail. It was becoming what we all call a whiteout. This is me a moment before the gun went off. I don't know if you can tell, but folks, this is not the face of a confident man. As Ivan yanked us to the starting line, I watched the team before me speed ahead, the snow beginning to blow harder across the lake, and soon her dogs dissolved in the mist. I heard the starter count down, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we sprang forward. I was conscious of 3 shouts, then before all noise faded before the wind. One was a send-off from the starter, a burly man hooded in his snowmobile suit who yelled, "Don't let go of the sled." And then I heard Ivan's hopeful cry to his wife, Kathy, "Did you tell Joanne to watch out for them?" And I heard his quick burst of distress. "You didn't?" "You didn't?" And then the last words I heard, "We've made a mistake." "200 yards along the trail, I saw to my horror that Joanne, the driver of the team that was supposed to take care of me, was in trouble herself. Her team was now turned crossways to the trail, and I was headed for its unprotected flank. I had been actually taught 3 commands, haw to the left and G to the right, and there was one more, the only one in my panic I could remember. I shut my eyes and I yelled as loud as I could, "Straight on!" The title, don't let me ever have your dogs, okay? The title of the story in the final chapter I call The Worst 30 Minutes of My Entire Life. But here is why we do this work. It gave me a great story. And these stories, this book, the voices I heard, that's how I will always remember my thousands of days at Yankee. I want to thank all of you for being here. It means a lot to me to tell these stories to you. I love hearing your questions, and afterwards I'll be happy to not only sign the books if you wish, but I also will inscribe messages for you as a keepsake. So thank you very much for coming.
All right, thank you, Mel. This astonishing collection of stories and visuals about this area, about New England, really showing kind of the way in which ordinary things are quite extraordinary, and it's really a testament to the power of storytelling. This is open for questions. If you're in the chat, if you're on Zoom, please go ahead and type your question into the chat, and I'm happy to read it out for Mel. And if you're in the room, just raise your hand, and I'm happy to bring the microphone so that everybody can hear it. Hear your question.
Don't be shy. I know it's hard the first time. Right there.
Hi, I'm David Monagle. I'm from Chicago. My wife is from Western PA. And I think for unknown reasons, I've always had New England envy. And it really is hard to explain to people, why did you find a place in northern Maine? You think Maine, they think the coast. And they think you're living an extravagant lifestyle, eating lobster every night. But we're outside Houlton, Maine, and we fall in love with Houlton, Maine. So all I wanted to do was thank you for giving a voice to something I can't explain.
Thank you. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you.
What's it say?
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk more about your early days as a freelance writer, because those were the days before the internet, before social media. How did you come up with story ideas back then, and what advice would you give to writers today, you know, who are searching, you know, for those unique people and stories to tell?
That's a great question. That's like a workshop question. That's a great question. So my early days were simply this. I sent in a story, unsolicited. I was working as a cook on Squirrel Island, Maine, off of Boothbay Harbor that summer. And I had been fired from a school called Elan in Maine. Some of you may have heard of Elan. It was a very notorious school for kids who had been in trouble, teenagers who had been in trouble. And instead of putting them in like detention centers or things like juvenile places, they came to Elan in Maine. Because I spoke some Spanish, because I was been in the Peace Corps, they hired me as a teacher. And many of these young people had trouble reading. And they were afraid of school. And so I thought playing basketball, I used to play basketball, playing basketball with some of these young men especially would make them easier to be in the classroom. That was against the Elan way of life, and they fired me. So I wrote about Elan, and I just sent it blind to the Maine Sunday Telegram. They published it, and the feature editor called me. His name was Eddie Fitzpatrick. He asked me to come in, and he said, I think I could use you, and I was a freelance writer, and he sent me from my very first story to the Freiburg Fair to write about, it was then called The Girly Show. I did not call it that, that's what it was called. And this was, I learned right from the start, treat people with respect. So I took these young women who would perform in this tent, and a lot of people, mostly men frankly, would kind of jeer at them. It was not a pretty thing. But I went with them afterwards, I asked them what they wanted to do with their lives. And to a young woman, every one of them, they wanted to be seen. They wanted to be dancers. They wanted to be in show business. And this is how they thought they were starting out. I wrote that story that way. And I was paid $40. And then he sent me to do a story about a hockey team in Lewiston, Maine, a minor league hockey team. He paid me $85 for that one. And then he saw that I actually could do this. And I started writing every 2 weeks, basically a 3,000-word story for $150 and no expenses. That came to about 5 cents a word, but I was learning a really important lesson. I was learning how to talk to people, and better yet, I was learning to listen to people. And I went all around Maine. There were very few places I didn't go. And after a few years of that, I had what's called a robust portfolio of stories, which I then drove to Yankee Magazine, didn't know anybody there, handed in this portfolio, and they saw that I could really do these stories, and they wanted me to work for them, and they actually paid expenses, and $400 a story. So my days at the Sunday Telegram ended, my days at Yankee started, and after a few years of that, he said, it's going to be cheaper for us to just bring you on staff, and that's how I got on staff. But in terms of how I got my stories, when I first started, I put an ad in the Portland paper offering to pay $5 to anybody who gave me an idea that I could turn into a story. And also, I lived at the Portland Library, and I read every possible magazine about New England. I went back, I looked for stories, so if this was like in the mid-70s, I looked to see what people were writing about in the 1960s, and I could think about, could I bring that story up to date? Things of that sort. And I read papers incessantly. That's how I heard about Ma Dudley. Ma Dudley's story didn't just kind of float in on a cloud. You know, I read about Ma Dudley in some kind of paper, probably from Aroostook County, or maybe the Bangor Daily News, and that's how I learned. That's how I learned about that. And even when I became an editor at Yankee, I subscribed, I think, to almost, you name it, just in Maine. I got the Ellsworth American, I got the Bangor Daily News, I got the Portland Press Herald, I think it's called Down East Fisherman. I just got all these papers, and I would look for what people were writing about, what people cared about. And one of my favorite stories about this is I saw just a little note, maybe a quarter inch in a Concord Monitor paper at New Hampshire, that a man named Dick Dyer, the fish and wildlife botanist, was going to be coming and speaking at the Concord Library about his efforts to try to save a plant on Mount Washington that only survived there, called the cinquefoil. I think it was called the cinquefoil. The cinquefoil. I went to that talk. I was just curious. That's the word. That's the key word. If you ask me, what do I tell writers? You have to have curiosity. You have to want to know. You have to want to get up off the chair and go to that talk by that botanist to see what he might say. I did not end up doing a story on the cinquefoil. Instead, he talked about going to the St. John River outside of Fort Kent, and he and the botanist from the University of Maine was going to count one by one. I think I have it mounted up on my thing. Let me see if that's there. Yeah, plant, there it is. That's called the Furbished lousewort. That's called the Furbished lousewort. And that was an endangered plant. And it was supposedly only existing in this one, along the banks of the St. John River. There was a dam at the time that was to be proposed called the Dickey-Lincoln Dam, multi-million-dollar dam that, if it had been constructed, was going to drown, among other places, the Allagash Village. Their work, and I was with them when they counted one by one over several days. I think they found 200 plus. It did not stop the dam by itself, not at all, but it led to more discussion. Do we really need this dam, and at what price? And in time, people like the time Senator Ed Muskie, who was very influential among the environmental movement, he came around. At first, he was in favor of the dam because of the economics of maybe some of the power it would produce. And he came around, and that dam was never built. And I never would have done this story. We called it Counting Hairy Parasites Along the St. John River, if I had not been curious about what this botanist was going to say. So curiosity is the biggest thing I would say, Melissa. Good question. Long answer, but good question.
How much artistic liberty do you take in your stories, and how true do you try to keep to them?
I want you to repeat that.
How much artistic liberty do you take into your stories, and how true do you try to keep to the original ones?
That's a really good question. But because it's called nonfiction, and because we have a fact checker, and every good magazine has a fact checker, if I make an error, I feel really, really bad about it. So if somebody is talking to me and I'm writing down what they say, or if I have a tape recorder, I will quote exactly what they say. I won't inject anything. I won't try to pretty it up. I can't think of anything I've ever consciously done to make it inaccurate from what I did. However, if I were to then turn some of these stories into fiction, because some of these stories could absolutely be the beginnings of a fictional short story or more, then of course you use what I know, and I would then fictionalize it. That's a great question.
Okay, maybe I have time for a question for you, Mel. One of the things I love about your writing is just the focus on work, just the focus on sort of the respect you have for the work that people are doing, right? It really is stories about labor, and it's incredible to kind of learn, right? The sort of like the emotion, the kind of love of work that's sort of at the heart of so many of these really impassioned stories. And, you know, as you know, I'm from Florida, and it reminds me of a lot of the people that I know, right? And so I guess I'm thinking about the ways, or my question here is, you know, this is a representation of New England, but the stories that you tell are really a representation of people, of humanity, right? In general, the stories, it could take place any place, right? Even around the world, right? Not even in the United States. And I wondered if you had a thought about sort of like, you know, is there something particular that makes it New England, or that has sort of, you know, that makes it kind of representation of this space? Or do you also see the way in which your stories are sort of the stories of people all over the world, really? Yeah.
Well, because the people I meet are in New England, that makes them New England stories in many ways. It's amazing when somebody knows that you're really interested in what they do. Not necessarily who they are, but what they do, and then you find out who they are through what they tell you about what they do. So, for example, I hope I have her on here. There. This is Lena Anderson. Lena Anderson worked in a sardine factory for, I believe, 60 years. Her hands were all gnarled because of cutting with scissors the heads off of these herring and then packing them. And I went to see her right when Stinson's closed. It was the last sardine factory in the U.S. that closed. And you would think that after that kind of labor for those many decades, she would be happy to know that she now could rest. And she was distraught. She was distraught because she was losing not just her friends, she was losing this place and this skill. She was this incredibly skilled sardine packer. So that is both unique to Maine and unique to New England, but also could be probably said of anybody anywhere in the world who had invested a certain skill, whatever it may be. And I love talking to people about what they did, what they do in their life, because they actually reveal a lot. That George Costain, who talked to me about what it was like to launch ships, I mean, if you had seen his face, I mean, he was like watching a movie unfold. He was remembering ships that had not gone the way he had wanted them to, when they had gotten stuck on the ways. Some ships that he knew had sometimes even toppled, not by him, but other places. I mean, he was an old man then, but his memory was so sharp, and he was back there launching those ships when he was talking to me. That's a really great thing to be part of.
Any other questions from Mel?
Well, that was awesome. And what I do, oh, go ahead, right there. Say it again.
Did the dogs on by? Straight ahead.
Say that one more time.
I said, did your dog team on by? Did they go straight ahead?
That's where I'm supposed to say, well, if you read the story, you will find out. And the books are right back there. But I will say this. that was not the worst moment of that thing. Things happened later on, but but I don't think you want me to race your dogs. Is that, am I clear? So I do more, I can sign my name if you'd like, but I also love writing messages to people, like personal messages, so don't be shy about asking me that if you'd like. So again, thank you, everybody. You're an great audience.